So the day that I'm recording this happens to be the day that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is meeting and is going to decide what their next policy initiative or non-policy initiative is going to be, if there's going to be a change in policy or not. This afternoon we expect the Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke to emerge from the meeting and announce what the Fed is going to do. The Federal Reserve is something that we're going to talk about here in Chapter 18. We're going to talk about a little bit about money and then define the Federal Reserve and kind of tell a little bit about what they do. When we think about money, we have to think about how things would be first in the absence of money. Why do we have money that's issued by the federal government? Why do we use money at all? Why am I willing to show up for work with only the promise that I will get these little green paper things, or in fact not even the green paper things, just an increase in the balance of those dollars in my checking account that electronically appears once a month? If there were no money, how would things operate? If we think about, for some reason in my mind, it's a medieval village where we have people who work as butchers and people who work as bakers. We have a lot of smiths, right? We have a blacksmith who works with metal. We have a coopersmith who makes barrels. We have all these people that have these very specialized jobs, and what we've seen is people are more productive and allow for higher levels of consumption if they're able to specialize in something and then trade with their neighbors. It makes everybody better off. And so to say, how would this trade work if there were no money? And it would be what we call a barter economy. So the two people that produce, maybe the butcher produces meat, and we have a dairy farmer that produces milk, and when the butcher wants a gallon of milk, he goes and says, how much meat can I trade you for your milk there? And those two may negotiate, and then they can agree upon terms of trade such that they say, well, trade me a pound of meat and I'll give you a gallon of milk, and they work out a deal that way. And this is called a barter economy, and it would be fine if there were no money, because we could just trade the things that we produce for the things that we wish to consume. The problem with the barter economy is that it can get quite expensive in terms of opportunity cost. Because if the dairy farmer were to come to me and offer me a gallon of milk for my services, I would have to say, no, I don't like to drink milk, so why don't you go trade your milk for some eggs and then bring those eggs to me, that and then I can trade you that way. Instead of trying to find something that I want, we can just trade our goods and services for money. Money eliminates the need for what we call a double coincidence of wants. For two people to be able to trade in that barter economy, they each have to want what the other is producing, and then they can negotiate and trade those two things. Money eliminates that requirement. So now I can accept money from the payment of the goods and services that I produce, because I know that I can take that money and it is widely accepted for payment for goods and services. So what we use money for is a medium of exchange. It's better than barter. It allows us to exchange more freely. We use money as a unit of account. That is, we measure things. We kind of use it as a common denominator. That is, we can tell how much an hour of my labor is worth. We can translate it using dollars. So if a worker earns $20 per hour, that means an hour of his labor is worth 20 of those $1 soft drinks that we mentioned in a previous discussion. We mentioned before using dollars to measure the amount of output in our economy, right? GDP. We use those dollars as a unit of account. So that I produce or consume $20 worth of something. We use money as a store of value. We have professions or occupations like agriculture, where in a barter economy, if I was a tomato farmer, I would have to do all my bartering in the spring and summer when my tomato crop comes in, and in the case where we're using money in our economy, we can sell our tomatoes in the summer. We can save that money and use it year round. So the medium of exchange, use of money, the unit of account, and store of value. So originally, as money emerged, it wasn't something that was necessarily mandated by any governments. People just realized that the barter economy could get expensive and it could get difficult to find someone to trade with, and so people were able to use things that already had value. So if we think of something like gold, would be commodity money. And so people would trade their goods and services or take payment for their labor in gold because they knew that they could take that gold and it had its own inherent value. They could go trade that for the other things that they wanted to consume. But carrying around lots of gold in your pocket and keeping up with it, and it's heavy and it's cumbersome and it's difficult to tell how pure it is. And so what emerged over time was what we call fiat money. Fiat means let it be so. So fiat money, fiat's a Latin word that means let it be so. And so that fiat money is money that doesn't have any inherent value. Our money is printed on this kind of cottony paper substance that doesn't have really any value if it doesn't have those words printed on it that is backed by the full faith of the United States government. This fiat money is money because of government mandate, and no other reason, has no real value in use outside of its use as money. So in our discussion of money, we have to talk about the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is a quasi-independent entity that is kind of a government-owned, but has its own bit of independence. The boards of governors are appointed by politicians, but they're not elected. They're intended to be free from political pressures. They are responsible for conducting monetary policy. In our last chapter, we talked about fiscal policy being changes in the government and taxing policy to try to affect the level of GDP. Monetary policy is changes in the money supply to try to affect the level of GDP. And the underlying idea is pretty simple, is that the government can adjust the amount of money that's out there, and adjusting the amount of money that is out there has an effect on interest rates, which directly affects consumption and investment. So if the government wanted to decrease interest rates, they can do so by increasing the money supply. We get increases in money supply, we get decreases in at least nominal interest rates, and we should see, as a result of that, we should see changes in consumption and long-term investment decisions in response to those changes in interest rates. So we'll see what the Federal Reserve announces about how they are going to try to affect GDP through monetary policy at this point. They are responsible for supervising and regulating banks, and they are also the banker for banks. So there could be a time, there's often times when banks need to borrow money to meet short-term liquidity obligations. If they need cash for day-to-day business and don't have cash because a lot of banks' assets are outstanding loans. So if they happen to need cash, they can go borrow some for a short time from the Federal Reserve. They say that the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort for banks. So these are the roles of the Fed, and we'll have some news articles for you to read as we proceed through this section. Thank you, and make sure you finish your homework.